Jon Snow stood upon the battered ramparts of Winterfell, the wind knife-cold against his cheeks. The snow fell thickly, burying every trace of color beneath ghostly drifts, turning the castle courtyard into a pale, haunted realm. His breath came in short, white puffs as he surveyed the chaotic battlefield where the living clashed with the dead in a desperation so fierce it bordered on madness. The White Walkers, those terrible beings that once were rumor and myth, had broken through the outlying fortifications. Their icy ranks marched inexorably closer, an unstoppable tide of pale blue death. They bore spears crafted from magic ice, shimmering beneath the muted glow of the waning moon. Their cold eyes shone like hungry stars, pitiless and patient. Jon could feel the hopelessness in the air like a malignant presence. It had infected nearly everyone, northerners, knights of the Vale, and wildlings alike, until they fought like drowning men, arms flailing, refusing to go under but unable to breathe. The shrieking wind drowned out the last vestiges of morale. At times all he could hear was the crack of ice spears against shields, the dull thump of bodies falling, and the high, keening wails of those unlucky enough to be taken. By the flickering torches mounted along the walls he saw pockets of living warriors still resisting, a sworn brother from the Night's Watch using a broken sword to decapitate a snarling wight. A giant from beyond the wall smashing reanimated corpses into clumps of frozen slush with each thunderous step. Yet, no matter how many undead fell, more came, pushing onward with tireless single-mindedness. Jon clenched his jaw and gripped the hilt of Longclaw with sweaty palms. The sword's pommel, shaped like a snarling wolf's head, felt reassuring against his hand, but the steel alone could not banish the sense of doom creeping through his veins. He allowed himself a moment to glance behind him. On the rampart steps stood Daenerys Targaryen, her white hair plastered to her forehead by freezing drizzle. She had lost Regal to the Night King in an ambush 2 nights ago, and Drogon was still aloft somewhere in the blizzard-thick sky, terrorizing the undead from above. Despite the fierce pride in her eyes, it was clear exhaustion ate at her resolve, threatening to unravel the queen who had once believed herself unstoppable. Ser Davos had taken an arrow of ice in his thigh and limped about, voice hoarse, bellowing orders that were swallowed by the gale. Tyrion Lannister was somewhere on the battlements as well, face drawn tight with dread yet refusing to cower. The fighters from Essos, those stoic unsullied, had formed tight ranks in the courtyard. Their once pristine spears rattled under the unrelenting onslaught, but they stood firm, a bulwark of discipline in a tide of chaos. Jon's eyes searched, unbidden, for Ghost, his loyal direwolf. But Ghost had vanished into the swirling white, last seen leaping into a cluster of undead. Jon had been forced to turn away as the defenders on the walls needed him. Yet he could not quell the gnawing dread that Ghost might have fallen. The wind shifted direction, momentarily clearing the swirling snow. Beyond the courtyard, Jon glimpsed the monstrous figure of the Night King atop his undead dragon, Viserion. A haunting shriek tore across the battlefield. The dragon's dead eyes burned with an otherworldly hue, and foul blue fire spewed from its maw, carving a swathe of char and ash through the ranks of the living. In the dragon's shadow, the White Walkers advanced. They wore armor of ice, beautiful and fearsome, etched with eerie runes. Their leader raised a gnarled spear that glistened with starlight. Jon felt the chill of it across the distance, creeping down his spine. "Jon!" Daenerys' shout carried to him, sharper than the wind. She stood on a higher step of the wall, face set in ferocious determination. "We're being overrun. We must do something." He swallowed down his fear. "We hold them as long as we can," was all he could manage to call back. Another bolt of undead dragon flames slammed into the northern wall, sending stone and rubble exploding into the courtyard below. Screams echoed, lost in the cacophony. Jon descended the steps, forcing his legs to move. Fear would do no good. He had to act. If the living were to stand any chance, they needed some miracle. Or some final stand. He felt certain that the Night King was near his greatest triumph, and nothing short of pure, desperate impossibility could halt it. His breath came faster as he passed through the courtyard gates and into the yard proper, where half-buried corpses littered the ground. He could not tell friend from foe anymore. The swirling snow, mingled with flurries of ash, obscured both clothing and faces. Men coughed, their lungs burned by the freezing air. Horses shrieked, maddened by the stench of death. At the far end of the yard, a white skull was crushed under the foot of a living soldier, who then collapsed as another undead sank its teeth into his shoulder. All around him, men were dying. And somewhere beneath this endless bleakness, Ghost was out there, fighting, or perhaps already torn apart, his white fur drenched in blood. Jon closed his eyes for a heartbeat, summoning a spark of that old, stubborn courage he had learned on the wall. He reminded himself that while breath still filled his lungs, he would fight. And he would not stop, not until the last White Walker had been cast down. Longclaw felt impossibly heavy in his hand, the Valyrian steel the only defense he truly trusted against the others. He strode between the chaos, ignoring the aches and bruises that covered his own body. Every warrior who could hold a blade was essential, but they were dwindling. He raised the sword high, slicing through a white as it lunged. Another took its place, hands clawing at the air. He grit his teeth, severed its arm, then decapitated it with a savage blow. Ice crystals and blackened blood sprayed across the snow. An unearthly moan rose above the shrieking wind. Jon whipped around. A White Walker, tall and slender, clad in swirling frost and laced with hoarfrost armor, stepped forward, spear at the ready. Its eyes glowed with ancient malevolence. The creature cocked its head as though studying him and advanced. Jon braced his stance and prepared for the strike. The air crackled with supernatural cold, turning his every breath into a ragged gasp. The White Walker moved with fluid grace, lunging in with a spear that shimmered like a crystal caught in moonlight. Jon parried. The shock of the impact shot up his arms, nearly sending him to his knees. Longclaw's Valyrian steel rang out in fierce protest, but held. He twisted, bringing his blade around, only to meet another swift jab. The White Walker's face showed no emotion, only eerie, timeless hatred. Jon sidestepped, letting the icy spear glance off the edge of Longclaw, then countered with a slashing strike to the creature's torso. Shards of frost and ice flew, and a howl like a dying winter wind tore from the walker's mouth. It stumbled. Jon pressed the advantage, hacking down again. The White Walker disintegrated into shards of ice that melted into the snow, leaving only its spear behind. Jon clenched his jaw. One more down. But one was not enough. He turned. In that moment, a sudden and furious howling erupted from the darkness. Wolves? It was an unmistakable sound, deep, resonant, carrying centuries of primal fury. It pierced the hearts of every living fighter in the courtyard. Heads turned. Even the mindless wights paused, momentarily confused, as if something ancient and unrelenting had stepped onto the stage of this desperate battle. Jon's heart pounded. He knew that howl. Or at least some part of him understood it was a direwolf cry, magnified by countless throats. There had always been stories about the direwolves, how once they roamed the north in packs so vast they blackened the forests at night, how they used to be guardians of the old gods. But in the modern age, direwolves were few and scattered. Many believed them extinct south of the wall. Yet here, now, in the midst of death's frozen domain, that impossible sound rose again, mighty, defiant, powerful enough to stir even those who had lost all hope. Another howl split the sky, savage and triumphant. Suddenly, through the swirling drifts, Jon saw shapes flickering in and out of view. Large shapes. Enormous silhouettes bounding across the plains outside the castle gates. A living wave of fur and muscle, eyes glinting with ancient magic. His throat went dry. Ghost, he whispered, scarcely believing. His direwolf was one of those shapes running at their head. He caught only glimpses through the blizzard, Ghost's familiar alabaster coat, taller than any hound, a streak of white amid the gloom. Beside him, countless wolves moved, coats in shades of charcoal, silver, and midnight. Some were so large they dwarfed even the biggest warhounds, their eyes shone with uncanny intelligence. More unbelievable still, they carried an aura of something primal, something more than flesh and bone. The fighting in the courtyard faltered as living and undead alike turned to see this legion of dire wolves converge from the darkness. A wave of howls rose, rolling over the castle walls like thunder. And then they charged. The gates had been left shattered by the onslaught of the dead, but the dire wolves needed no invitation. They vaulted the broken gate, leapt over half-buried corpses, and descended upon the unsuspecting wights with an almost supernatural ferocity. Fangs crunched through frozen bones. Claws raked rotting flesh. The direwolves moved with coordinated precision, a pack mind forging them into a lethal force. Their eyes glowed, shimmering not in the cold blue of the undead, but in hues of gold, amber, and fiery red colors that spoke of life and warmth and raw, unchained power. In mere seconds, the courtyard was alive with the snarls and roars of beasts that had not been seen in such numbers for thousands of years. A reek of ancient magic permeated the air, as though the old gods themselves had awakened to protect the north in its hour of greatest need. The White Walkers, for the first time, hesitated. Their strides faltered, and though they knew no fear, they recognized an adversary born of the same primal energies that shaped them. The direwolves were no mere animals. Each was a spark of something older than men's kingdoms, older than the wall. Jon, momentarily stunned, recovered his wits. He slashed through a wight that had stumbled in its attempt to engage the new threat, and then, calling out to the men and women still standing, he roared, "Fight! For the living!" His voice rang out with renewed strength, the tide of despair receding beneath a wave of hope. "Fight! Sword arms rose once more. The defenders, bolstered by the direwolves, pressed forward with a savage cry. The whites found themselves beset from two sides, pinned against the newly arrived direwolf army on one flank while the living surged on the other. The undead crumpled under the direwolves' terrifying jaws, some were torn in half with almost casual cruelty. Where the White Walkers appeared, direwolves hurled themselves at them with single-minded rage. Blue flame from the undead dragon scorched some of the wolves as they tried to leap upon Viserion, but the pack was too vast. Over the parapets, archers rained down arrows, ordinary arrows now seeming more effective with the demoralizing effect the dire wolves had on the enemy's lines. Stunned exclamations rippled through the battered defenders. No one had seen so many dire wolves in living memory. Perhaps the old gods had truly taken pity on mortals this night. Jon heard Grey Worm call out in his thick accent, rallying a small phalanx of Unsullied to push into the breach. He heard Tormund Giantsbane's bellow of astonished delight somewhere behind him. It was as if the entire castle, the entire battlefield, had taken a collective breath of fresh air. And then Jon saw him, Ghost, bounding through the chaos with blood-soaked fur. He was larger than Jon remembered, looming like a small bear, eyes reflecting fierce intelligence. The dire wolf launched himself at a knot of whites, scattering them like leaves. One of the White Walkers turned, ice spear raised, but Ghost was too quick. He clamped his jaws around the walker's arm and, with a savage twist, tore it free. The undead creature screeched, toppling into icy shards. The spear clattered into the snow. Ghost let out a triumphant snarl. Jon could not help but shout Ghost's name, voice thick with relief. The direwolf's ears twitched, and for a moment man and wolf locked gazes across the carnage. Jon saw pride and ferocity there, and something more, the sense that Ghost was not alone in leading these beasts. Something larger, older, was guiding them all. All around, the direwolves pressed their advantage. Their eyes glowed like lanterns in the swirling darkness, and their howls wove together into an almost ritualistic sound. More poured in from beyond the walls, 2,000-3,000, or more, an impossible number that should not exist. Yet here they were, bounding out of the open night, weaving between the twisted corpses, pouncing upon the dead with vicious skill. Daenerys, standing high above, stared in wonder. Drogon, drawn by the howling, swept through the sky and incinerated a wave of whites that had managed to regroup near the southwestern tower. Flames washed over the courtyard, momentarily reflecting in the direwolves' eyes like flickers of living fire. Jon wrenched himself back to the present. The living might have gained new allies, but the White Walkers were not defeated yet. The Night King still loomed, silent and wrathful. He brandished his glacial spear from atop Viserion. His undead dragon soared overhead, unleashing torrents of pale blue flame that turned men to ice and cinders within moments. Jon could not let that creature wreak havoc unopposed. It would decimate the direwolves, or at least many of them, if it got the chance. He sprinted through the carnage, Longclaw slashing at any undead in his path. A direwolf bounded alongside him, a colossal beast with fur so dark it seemed to devour the light. It snarled at the whites that leapt forward, scattering them with snapping jaws. Together, man and wolf advanced toward a battered portion of the courtyard where the top of the wall had collapsed. Daenerys was descending a shaky wooden ladder, flanked by Jorah Mormont, who still clutched his sword despite the deep slash in his side. Jon reached them, breath ragged. "We need to ground that dragon," he said through clenched teeth, his eyes flicking to the sky. "Or we lose everything." Daenerys nodded, though her face was drawn with grief and exhaustion. "Drogon can fight him in the skies, but if the Night King kills Drogon—" She trailed off, unwilling or unable to finish the thought. Jorah's voice rasped. "We must do what is necessary. Let Drogon handle the dragon. Jon, you must find a way to the Night King." Jon wiped the sweat and snow from his brow. "We'll need cover. Those direwolves. By the gods, I don't know how this is happening, but we should use them. If we can keep the bulk of the undead army occupied, we can get in close." Daenerys set her jaw. "Drogon and I will give you that chance." She looked at Jorah, eyes full of sorrow and gratitude. "Keep yourself alive, sire." And then she took off, ignoring any protest, racing across the courtyard toward the black shape of Drogon, who had landed atop a broken tower. The enormous dragon hissed, tail lashing the rubble-strewn ground. Daenerys climbed up with practiced grace, though her face twisted in pain. The moment she was secure, Drogon leapt skyward, wings beating the storm-laden air. Jon turned to Jorah, but before he could speak, a swirling cluster of whites surged around them. Yora yelled a warning and hacked down two in quick succession. Jon spun, blocking a skeletal arm that aimed a rusty sword at his chest. The black direwolf that had been helping Jon pounced on another attacker, pinning it with a thunderous growl and shredding it in seconds. More direwolves joined in, flooding the courtyard, their savage power unstoppable. For a dizzying moment, the world dissolved into chaos again. Arrows whistled. The thunder of Drogon's wings rumbled overhead. Jon caught glimpses of direwolves bounding forward in unstoppable waves, toppling White Walkers, snapping up whites as though they were mere rabbits. He saw Tormund and a squad of wildlings driving their axes into the crumbling undead ranks. Above it all, the Night King soared, his undead dragon letting out a shriek that froze blood. Jon steeled himself. He pushed through the melee, searching for a path beyond the courtyard and into the open ground beyond Winterfell's broken outer walls. That was where the Night King kept dipping lower, as if taunting them. Jon's boots slipped on blood-slick stone. He almost stumbled over a corpse, but the black direwolf nudged him forward, as if urging him on. He caught sight of Ghost again. The White Wolf was in the thick of it, leading a savage charge against a group of whites trying to encircle a cluster of wounded men. Ghost tore through them, and the men found themselves spared the mortal blow that had been seconds away. Ghost's muzzle was crimson, steam rising from his snout in the freezing air. Around him, other direwolves pressed forward, forming a ring of fur and fang that shielded the wounded. Jon felt an emotion akin to awe. This was no random pack. They were organized, almost disciplined in their savagery, an army of living symbols of the North's ancient might. Summoning the last of his energy, Jon signaled to Yora and a few others, Theon Greyjoy among them, battered but standing, to follow him. They dashed past the bodies and rubble, aiming for the large breach in Winterfell's walls that led to the open fields. 1,000 direwolf paw prints marred the snow there, forming a labyrinth of tracks. The swirling winds howled at them, but the wide expanse of the battlefield opened, revealing more horrifying sights. Tens of thousands of the dead still advanced. Even with the direwolves' intervention, the undead army stretched into the distance, a black mass that blotted out the horizon. In the sky, Drogon clashed with Viserion, their roars shaking the heavens. Blue flame and red gold fire collided in midair, swirling into scorching cyclones before dissipating. The ground below was cratered with fresh scorch marks and mounds of steaming ice. Jon staggered through the snow, scanning for the Night King. Then he saw the dreadful silhouette perched on a small hill of corpses, some unimaginable vantage of carnage. The Night King was calmly waiting, frost-crowned head turning slowly from side to side as though surveying his domain. A pair of White Walkers stood guard near him, tall as gaunt specters, each clutching an icy blade. When they saw Jon and his companions approaching, they moved, gliding over the snow without disturbing a single flake. Their malevolent stares fixed upon Jon. Theon let out a roar, sprinting ahead, broken spear in hand, determined to atone for past sins or die trying. Jon shouted, "Theon," but his voice was lost to the wind. Yora grimaced, following as quickly as his wounded leg allowed. The black direwolf bounded ahead too, then paused, hackles raised, letting out a snarl so low it seemed to vibrate in Jon's chest. Time seemed to slow. Jon advanced, meeting the first White Walker's blow head-on. Longclaw clashed with the icy blade, sending out a shockwave of frost. The second White Walker angled to intercept Theon, who hurled himself forward with reckless abandon. They crashed together in a swirl of snow and shards of ice. Jon found himself locked in a deadly dance with the White Walker. He struck low, but the walker parried with inhuman speed. It slashed at Jon's ribs. Jon twisted away, only to find himself nearly face-to-face with the creature's lifeless blue gaze. It thrust again. Longclaw met the thrust, but the force behind it was tremendous. Jon's arms trembled. The White Walker hissed, a sound like wind slicing through a narrow pass. From the corner of his vision, Jon glimpsed Theon driving his broken spear into the second walker's chest. For a moment it looked as though Theon might kill it, but the spear splintered. The walker laughed soundlessly and backhanded him, sending Theon sprawling. Yora lunged to defend Theon, only to stagger as his sword arm was clipped by an icy blade. The black direwolf sprang into action. With an enraged snarl it lunged at the second White Walker, jaws catching the creature's shoulder. A horrific snapping sound ensued, followed by an otherworldly shriek. The walker's arm tore free, dissolving into a flurry of ice crystals. It struggled briefly, then collapsed, shattering like glass. The black direwolf landed on all fours, scanning for the next threat. Jon barely had time to register the victory before the White Walker he faced pressed forward, an unrelenting flurry of cold steel. Jon deflected each blow with near-desperate focus. He sidestepped a downward slash, then spun, bringing Longclaw around in a backhand slice that caught the walker at the midsection. The creature disintegrated into a silent cloud of ice particles. Panting, Jon steadied himself, then looked to the hill where the Night King had stood. The dread figure was still there, unmoving, watching the slaughter as though it were a particularly dull spectacle. Now was the moment. If Jon could only get close enough to strike the Night King down, he might shatter the entire undead host. That was their only real hope. Yora. Theon. Jon shouted. Keep the whites off me. They nodded, battered and bleeding, but resolute. He rushed forward, closing the gap to the Night King with heavy breaths. The ground was slick with gore, making every step a precarious task. In the skies above, Drogon and Viserion continued their terrible duel, each pass sending blasts of flame or ice across the battlefield. Bodies littered the plain, half buried in fresh snow. And still, more direwolves joined the fight, pouring out of the gloom, their howls weaving a fearsome chorus. Jon reached the foot of the mound of corpses. The stench was overwhelming, hot and cold at once, a reek of death that churned his stomach. The Night King lifted his spear of ice, gesturing as if in a silent command. All around, the dead stirred. Whites rose by the dozens, clawing their way up, driven by his unholy will. Jon had no choice but to fight through them. He carved a path, Longclaw rising and falling with lethal efficiency. Each strike severed limbs, shattered skulls, or embedded itself in rotted flesh. The ravenous whites clawed at him, their teeth snapping. One managed to seize Jon's cloak. He yanked free, stabbing downward until the creature ceased moving. They came on and on, fueled by the Night King's malice. It was then that the pack arrived. Ghost, leading a contingent of enormous direwolves, barreled into the throng of whites around Jon. White, gray, and black fur blurred as they tore at the rotting corpses. The wolves slashed through the undead ranks with a fury that defied reason. Bones cracked, sinews ripped, and the whites fell in droves. This sudden onslaught allowed Jon to push closer. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of prophecy. Jon felt something ancient stirring in his blood, as if the presence of these dire wolves awakened a deep chord inside him. Their howls rang in his ears, urging him onward, a savage cry that refused to bow to death. He was reminded of the stark words, "Winter is coming," and how it once felt like a grim warning. But in this moment, with the dire wolves around him, those same words felt more like a rallying cry. Yes, winter had come, and so too had the North's most primal defenders. Finally, Jon reached the apex of the hill. Only a scant few yards separated him from the Night King. Up close, he could see the creature's cold, dead features pale as frost, with patterns of cracks etched into its flesh as if it were carved from a glacier. The Night King regarded Jon with an almost bored expression. Then, with excruciating slowness, he raised his arm. Jon braced himself, expecting the same necromantic gesture that had once nearly ended them at Hardhome. A savage roar disrupted the moment. Ghost and two other direwolves bounded up beside Jon, snarling at the Night King. For an instant, the Night King's icy gaze flicked from Jon to the wolves, and a tiny frown seemed to crease his otherwise emotionless features. It was as though he recognized them as a genuine threat in a way he had not expected. Jon lunged. He swung Longclaw in an arc aimed at the Night King's midsection. The blow never connected. The Night King caught the blade on his spear of ice with preternatural speed, stopping the sword in mid-swing. The force reverberated up Jon's arms. Ghost leapt, aiming for the Night King's throat, but the spear whipped around, catching the direwolf midair. Ghost was thrown aside with a yelp, crashing into the snowdrift below the corpse mound. Heart-clenching, Jon pressed the attack. He battered at the Night King's defenses, each strike deflected by that unearthly spear. Frost swirled around them, and the air itself felt hostile, biting into Jon's exposed flesh like 1,000 frozen needles. The Night King made no sound, his expression remained unreadable, a perfect sculpture of malevolence. Jon slashed again. The spear spun, a flash of shimmering ice. He barely avoided a counterstrike that would have skewered him through the heart. Then the ground beneath them shook. At first, Jon thought it was the wind or the relentless marching of the undead. But it grew, a rumble deep in the earth, accompanied by a chorus of direwolf howls that reached a crescendo. Something was happening. The direwolves, thousands strong, spread out across the field in a vast formation. Their eyes glowed brighter, almost as if channeling an ancient magic from the land itself. A powerful presence filled the air, crackling with unseen energy. Jon could sense it thrumming under his feet, coursing through his veins like liquid fire. The whites in the near vicinity hesitated, twitching and moaning in disorientation. The Night King, too, felt it. His gaze shifted, confusion clouding his icy eyes. He raised his free hand as if to cast some spell. Before he could, Jon saw Ghost clamber back up the mound, blood matted around the direwolf's flank but fury burning in his crimson eyes. With a guttural snarl, Ghost lunged again, seizing the opportunity the Night King's distraction provided. This time, the alpha direwolf clamped his jaws around the Night King's arm, the same arm that was lifted to enact dark magic. A shriek like the shrieking wind tore from the Night King's lips. His unnatural coldness flared, frost spreading across Ghost's muzzle. Steam rose where direwolf saliva met the Night King's flesh. Jon seized that moment. Summoning every last ounce of his strength, he drove Longclaw forward in a powerful thrust. The Valyrian steel blade found its mark, piercing through the Night King's torso. A wave of cold exploded outward, knocking Jon back. He stumbled, nearly losing his grip on Longclaw, but he held fast. The Night King clutched at the sword, impaling him, eyes widening in something akin to shock. For an instant, it seemed as though the world stood still. Snow hung suspended in the air. The howls of the dire wolves went silent. Viserion and Drogon, locked in mid-battle overhead, froze in a macabre tableau. The dying torches flickered but did not dim. Jon felt his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out all else. Then the Night King's body began to crack, fissures spreading across his chest and up his neck. A single note, high-pitched and haunting, emanated from him, echoing across the battlefield. Longclaw's Valyrian steel shimmered bright silver blue as the Night King crumbled into shards of ice. The shards clattered to the ground, dissolving into a thin mist, leaving nothing but a faint, pulsing cold that vanished almost immediately in the surrounding snow. He was gone. A tremor ran through the undead ranks, as if an invisible string holding them together had been cut. One by one, they collapsed, dropping to the snow in lifeless heaps, weapons falling from grasping hands, skulls rolling across the battlefield. The monstrous white giants crumbled too, hitting the ground with resounding thuds. In seconds, the entire undead horde disintegrated. Viserion shrieked overhead, tore free from its battle with Drogon, and began to spiral downward, losing what remained of its supernatural animation. With one final, pitiful moan, the undead dragon crashed to the earth and lay still, rotted wings crumpling into dust. Silence. A profound, stunned silence descended upon Winterfell and its surroundings. The living stood, panting, hearts pounding, hardly daring to believe what their eyes told them. Men leaned on their spears. Women clutched weapons with trembling hands. Faces covered in gore and grime looked around at the mountains of corpses. The direwolves lifted their voices in a long, echoing howl, a victory cry that reverberated in every battered tower, every broken rampart. Ghost, panting heavily, limped to Jon's side, pressing his muzzle against Jon's shoulder. Jon let out a breath he did not realize he was holding and sank to his knees, burying his face in the direwolf's thick fur for a moment. A moment later, Daenerys brought Drogon down in a slow, labored descent. Blood streaked the great dragon's scales where Viserion had scored him with icy claws, but he was alive. Daenerys slid off, ignoring her own injuries, and hurried to Jon's side. She said nothing, only looked from Jon to the crumbled ice shards and back again, tears glistening in her eyes. Yora arrived next, moving stiffly, one hand pressed to his wounded side, and Theon, pale but alive, followed close behind. Nobody spoke. The hush was absolute, broken only by distant crackling flames and the moaning wind. At length, Tormund Giant Bane trudged up, leaning on his axe, a grin splitting his wild beard. He let out a whoop that shattered the silence, and others took it up in triumph. A ragged cheer spread from the battered courtyard to the ramparts. Men and women of all ranks found themselves shouting, laughing, weeping. The undead were gone. The Night King was no more. Jon rose shakily, leaning on Ghost for support. His legs threatened to give out from pure exhaustion, but a fierce pride sparked in his chest. The direwolves swarmed around, numbering in the thousands, each massive form bearing fresh wounds and bloodied fur. Yet they stood tall, eyes bright. It was as though they had carried the spirit of the North with them onto the battlefield, turning despair into hope. As the echoes of the victory cries subsided, Jon gently placed a hand on Ghost's head. The direwolf closed his eyes, exhaling a soft huff of contentment. Around them, the other direwolves seemed to quietly gather, forming a great circle in the snow as though awaiting some unspoken command. Jon, and all those who witnessed, felt the weight of their gaze. It was eerie but not threatening, rather a sense of communion, an acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just transpired. In the swirl of snow and blood, these wolves, rumored to be extinct in such numbers for centuries, had answered the call of the living. An older man in patched fur, one of the free folk, limped forward and muttered reverently, "The old gods have returned." Nobody contradicted him. Daenerys placed a hand on Jon's arm, voice quiet yet resolute. "We owe them our lives," she said, gesturing to the direwolves. "They came for us in our darkest hour." Jon nodded. His throat felt thick. He glanced around. Winterfell lay in ruins, half the walls broken or scorched, the gates splintered beyond recognition. He could see bodies in every direction, men, women, unsullied, Dothraki, northerners, wildlings. So many had fallen, and yet they had prevailed. The living had endured where death was meant to claim all. Looking at the assembled wolves, Jon murmured, "Ghost, all of you, thank you." He knew it was inadequate, but words were all he had. He remembered that moment when the dire wolves had arrived, as if summoned by ancient magic. He sensed that this was more than just a random gathering. The North itself had beckoned them, or some power older than any mortal knowledge. The black direwolf that had fought by his side limped closer, favoring a hind leg. It was nearly as large as Ghost, though its fur was streaked with silver scars. It lowered its great head, sniffing at Jon's hand. Jon let it, feeling a strange sense of kinship radiating from the beast. He could almost sense the pulse of some shared spirit, as though man and wolf were echoes of each other. Snow kept falling, gently now, as if no longer fueled by the storm of the Night King's magic. A hush permeated the plain once more, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the crackling of distant fires. Some men wept openly, holding each other. Others knelt to pray. A group of Unsullied formed up, battered but unbroken, saluting Daenerys and Jon in solemn pride. Tormund and the wildlings surveyed the cost of the battle with grim faces, but their eyes shone with relief. Jon took a faltering step forward, calling out in a loud voice that carried across the ruined battlefield, "The Night King is dead. Their army is gone." His words echoed. One by one, survivors took it up, chanting variations of the same news. Soon, it spread in a wave of disbelief that turned into cautious hope, then into unbridled elation. The foe they all dreaded was no more. Daenerys, still standing by his side, raised her voice as well. "The long night is over," she shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks, face half hidden by wind-blown hair. Drogon roared behind her, the victorious bellow resounding through the air. Amidst the cheering, Jon knelt in the snow beside Ghost, rubbing the direwolf's ears and examining the superficial burns and cuts. Ghost whined softly, licking Jon's gloved hand. The black direwolf padded near, and Ghost acknowledged it with a quiet rumble. Jon couldn't help a faint smile. He turned to see the rest of the direwolves holding their ground, forming a loose ring that encompassed much of the yard where the final stand had taken place. Beyond the castle walls, more shapes moved, wolves departing as silently as they came, melting back into the night. Whatever force had summoned them, it seemed their immediate purpose was fulfilled. Jon realized that these magnificent creatures might not remain. They weren't domesticated animals, nor an army bound by duty to any human master. They belonged to the wild, to the heart of winter's forests. And yet, some part of him longed to speak to them, to ask them why now, after so many centuries, had they come? The answer was perhaps unspoken in every battered breath they took, in every step they'd carved into the snow. Sometimes, in moments of dire need, the living and the forces of nature stood together against annihilation. Perhaps that was enough. Slowly, as though satisfied that the threat was gone, the dire wolves began dispersing. They slipped through the broken gates, back into the darkness. Their massive paws left deep tracks that the falling snow quickly began to fill. Some paused to sniff the air or glance back at Jon, Daenerys, and the other survivors. Then they vanished, swallowed by the night. The black direwolf lingered a moment longer, meeting Jon's gaze, then turned and followed the rest, leaving only Ghost behind. Ghost made a low whine and took a step as if to follow, but Jon gently placed a hand on the direwolf's flank. "Stay," Jon said softly, not as a command, but as a plea. Ghost looked at him, ears flicking, then nudged Jon's chest with his nose as though to say he understood. At length, Daenerys spoke, her voice trembling with relief and heartbreak. "We should tend to the wounded, bury the dead." She trailed off, the enormity of the task before them too large to comprehend in a single breath. Yet that was their duty now. The war was won, for the moment, and the realm needed its survivors to heal and rebuild. Jon turned, gazing upon the scene of devastation. Flames crackled in broken towers, sending twisting plumes of smoke into the sky. The snow was red with blood. Ice chunks from shattered White Walkers crunched underfoot. The battered remnants of their united army, the living, were all that remained to pick up the pieces. And yet there was hope, a fragile but undeniable hope, born from the knowledge that the greatest evil of their time had been defeated. Men and women began moving about to offer aid, lifting the wounded onto makeshift litters. A few trusted healers rummaged for herbs and bandages in the hastily arranged infirmaries. More torches were lit, revealing the scale of the destruction. Brienne of Tarth, battered but unbroken, helped Gendry to his feet. Arya Stark, face streaked with soot and gore, offered her arm to Sandor Clegane, who muttered curses under his breath but accepted the help. They had all fought, all bled. But they had survived. In time, dawn came, though it was a bleak and pallid light filtered through thick clouds and drifting snow. Yet it brought enough clarity to reveal the countless forms of the fallen. The dead from both sides lay intermingled, a testament to the cataclysmic struggle. Grim-faced soldiers, and those few unhurt, began the slow, somber task of separating the bodies of loved ones from the mass of twisted remains. Jon refused to rest just yet. He helped lift the wounded. He called for water and supplies. He trudged through the rubble and the icy slush, ensuring no one was left behind. Ghost followed him faithfully, limping slightly but refusing to be left. Daenerys, too, walked among the survivors, her quiet presence lending them courage. Those who still lived regarded Jon and Daenerys with awe, as though they were the living embodiments of some half-forgotten prophecy. But to Jon, the real miracle had been the direwolves, the primal fury that had saved them from certain doom. Eventually, as mid-morning light struggled through the swirling gray, Jon found a moment's pause. He stood at the breach in Winterfell's walls, staring out over the once endless ranks of the undead, now lifeless lumps scattered across the field. More direwolf tracks crisscrossed the snow, and in the far distance, movement flickered, a tail or a flash of fur, as the remnants of the pack slipped away into the forest. Ghost pressed close to Jon, his warmth a comfort in the vast cold. Jon stroked the direwolf's ears absently, eyes distant. He wondered if they would ever understand the full nature of what happened here. Would the world remember, decades from now, how a legion of direwolves appeared in mankind's darkest hour, turning the tide of certain defeat into a breathtaking victory? A voice came from behind him, quiet and weathered. "You did it, Jon. We did it." Ser Davos Seaworth, leaning on a crudely carved crutch, stared across the battlefield with tired relief. Jon shook his head slowly. "I couldn't have done it alone. None of us could. The wolves, Ghost." He trailed off, uncertain how to article. "Ate the enormity of it." Davos nodded, his breath visible in the chill air. "Aye, the North has secrets older than we know. Secrets older than the Maester's tales. Maybe this was always meant to happen, though I doubt we'll ever truly understand it." They fell silent for a long time, letting the cold wind sweep away the last vestiges of the undead threat. Finally, Davos sighed. "Well, I've corpses to burn and wounded to tend. A good man's work is never done." He offered Jon a stiff nod and limped off. Jon stayed a few moments longer, the raw wind whipping his hair, reminding him that life continued. Dawn's pale light had grown slightly stronger, illuminating the horizon. The snows no longer felt suffocating, just cold and pure, covering the land in a blank slate upon which they might build anew. In the distance, he thought he glimpsed a final silhouette, a great wolf standing against the backdrop of a dying storm. It was too far away to be sure if it was real or just his imagination. Then it disappeared, a shadow folding into white. Jon closed his eyes and whispered a silent thanks to the old gods, to chance, to destiny, whatever force had made this deliverance possible. When he turned back toward Winterfell, it was to face a new day, a day in which the long night had been vanquished and the living stood victorious, battered, and forever changed. The North had answered their call. Ghost, battered but alive, trotted loyally beside him, the last of his siblings still with the Stark. And though the armies of men and dragons had played their part, it was the dire wolves who would forever remain the mysterious saviors of that fateful night. When 3,000 snarling beasts poured forth from the winter woods to turn despair into hope and defeat into triumph. No one could say what the future held, but for now they had survived. The battle was over, the enemy undone. And if there was to be a tomorrow, they owed it in no small part to the dire wolf army that came to their rescue, a wild, improbable force, magically imbued, summoned by the ancient bonds of the North. Jon Snow did not know where they went, nor if they would ever return. But he would remember, as would all those who stood that day in the bloody snow, hearts pounding, when hope seemed lost and the howls of the dire wolves rose through the storm. It was a sound none would ever forget, a testament that in a world of ice and fire, wonders and terrors beyond imagining still walked the earth, and sometimes, if fate was merciful, they walked beside humankind instead of against it. He placed a comforting hand on Ghost's flank. Together, man and wolf passed through the ruined gates of Winterfell, stepping onto ground that was a graveyard but also a birthplace for legends. The future was uncertain, but for this moment, at least, they were free from the shadow of the dead. Outside, the wind keened, a low lament for the countless lives lost. But within Jon's breast burned the flicker of hope, fanned by the memory of 1,000 howls that had shattered the hold of winter's gloom. Thus, when the final tally of the living was counted and the fires for the dead were lit, the song of that night would never fade from the North's collective memory, how Jon Snow and Ghost, armed with the courage of friends and the fangs of direwolves, defied the Night King at the darkest hour and left his frozen empire in shards of melting ice. And though Winterfell's courtyard bore scars that might never fully heal, in those scars were etched the story of a triumph that would echo through generations, the story of the day when the old gods answered, sending forth 3,000 dire wolves to stand against the coming darkness and together with the living drive the cold night away. Jon Snow watched the funeral pyres burn. They dotted the courtyard of Winterfell and stretched beyond the gates, flames flickering bright against the pallid morning sky. The pungent aroma of burning flesh and would choke the air, accompanied by a low wind that moaned through the broken walls. Though the day was still bitterly cold, the warmth of so many roaring fires was enough to sting faces and redden eyes. Survivors moved in somber procession, bearing the bodies of fallen friends, families, and comrades, laying them carefully upon the stacked logs so their ashes might be carried on the wind. Everywhere, people wept, but there was a grim pride in their tears. Jon stood with Ghost at his side, the big white dire wolf silent and watchful. Some of the fires had begun to die down, leaving embers that glowed like tired coals. Winterfell itself was a ruin. The assault of the undead had pummeled towers and walls, one section of battlement was entirely gone, another teetered dangerously. The courtyard that once buzzed with training and gatherings now held only the hushed tasks of the living, gathering up the dead. Snow fell lightly, carried by a soft breeze rather than the tempest that had raged during the battle. The ground was caked in half-frozen slush, streaked red and brown. In pockets of the yard, workers from every walk of life, knights, wildlings, unsullied, labored side by side, shoveling rubble, salvaging what they could. In the midst of it all, Daenerys Targaryen knelt by one of the pyres, lips parted as though in silent prayer. She wore a thick cloak over her scorched armor. Her hair, caked with soot, bore evidence of the horrors she had witnessed. At her side stood Ser Jorah, swaying on his feet but refusing to rest. His bandaged midsection showed a dark blot of dried blood, and now and then his hand pressed there as if to make sure he still lived. Jon felt the ache of grief and exhaustion in every muscle. The moment he had driven Longclaw into the Night King seemed both an eternity ago and just seconds past. He still felt the echo of that reverberation. The shock of cold as the Night King's body cracked apart and fell to ice. The knowledge that the greatest threat to the living was vanquished should have brought him some measure of peace, but all he felt was a hollow sorrow for those who had not lived to see the sunrise. A half-dozen men, including Tormund Giantsbane, carried the corpse of a fallen giant from the battlefield. They dumped it onto an enormous pyre. The heat from that blaze scorched the air, making Tormund squint and step back. Even across the courtyard, Jon felt that surge of heat like a wave. Tormund's once boisterous voice, now subdued, rose in a farewell for his fellow freefolk who had perished. Some southern soldiers joined, bowing their heads in respect, a reminder that in this battle all dividing lines had vanished. They had stood and fallen as one. Ghost shifted restlessly beside Jon, letting out a low whine. Jon placed a hand on his thick fur, offering reassurance. The direwolf's wounds were minor, but he was not unscathed. His coat, once pristine white, bore clumps of matted blood. Already, the healers had offered to tend him, but Ghost was wary of strangers. He accepted Jon's touch alone without a hint of caution. Jon rubbed his companion's ear. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm here." He turned to look for the black dire wolf that had helped them in the final moments, a beast nearly as large as Ghost, with bright gold eyes. Jon had last seen it slipping away after the battle, shadowed by several others. Even now, hours later, he did not know the precise number of dire wolves that had come. Some said 3,000, others swore it was more. It hardly mattered, the sight of that many enormous wolves bounding out of the darkness like living shadows remained burned in every survivor's memory. Jon had spoken with men who insisted they saw the land itself split open and vomit forth wolves from ancient barrows. Others swore the dire wolves emerged from the godwood, from the heart tree itself. Superstitions ran wild in the aftermath of such a miracle. None could doubt the primal power that had come to their aid. The question, why, lingered in every conversation, though few spoke it aloud. Perhaps the old gods truly stirred from slumber in that desperate hour. Or maybe the wolves simply followed ghost or ghostly echoes of some ancient call. Jon had no answers, and a part of him did not want them. It was enough that the wolves had come, had saved the living from the final death. He thought of the stories old Nan used to tell about the first Stark lords, how they could skin change, how they ran with wolves in the earliest days of the North. Once he would have dismissed such tales as fables. No longer. A child's sob broke through Jon's reverie. A small boy, no more than 7, stood near a pyre, tears streaking through the grime on his face. He clutched a ragged stuffed animal that dangled from his gloved hand. Perhaps he'd lost both parents or siblings. Jon wanted to move toward him to offer some comfort, but he hesitated. So many had lost loved ones. Could a few words from a man they barely knew do any good? Yet he remembered how, as a boy, he had often felt comforted by kindness from strangers, or from the old maester in Winterfell. So he stepped forward. He knelt. "Hey!" he said softly. "Are you alone?" The boy sniffled. His eyes were big, shock still dancing in them. My mother, she went." He pointed vaguely at the pyre. "She saved me when the whites came through the gate." He broke off, as though the memory was too fresh to voice. Jon exhaled. "I'm sorry," he said, wishing he had grander words. "I promise we'll look after you. You're safe here." Safe was a hollow promise, given the state of Winterfell and the realm's uncertain future. But the Night King was gone. That was no small victory. "Do you have a name?" "Creighton," whispered the boy, hugging his toy. They said everyone's gone. But I'm not gone." Jon placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, you're not gone. And we're going to keep going. That's what your mother would have wanted." He looked around, spotting a group of healers, among them a weary northern woman, who was tending an elderly man's broken arm. "Go there," he said gently. "Tell them Jon Snow sent you. They'll see you have food and a place to sleep." The boy nodded, biting his lip. He walked away slowly, shoulders slumped, new tears falling. Jon stared after him for a moment, feeling the weight of all that loss. Ghost nudged Jon's arm, as if sensing his unease. In the distance, Davos Seaworth stood with the Knight of the Vale and a cluster of Northmen, discussing logistics of the wounded. They pointed toward the gate, likely considering how to clear away the rubble for supply carts. Gendry hammered at a broken piece of armor on a makeshift anvil, pausing now and then to wipe soot from his brow. Arya Stark hovered near him, glancing around with a wary look in her eyes, as if half expecting another wave of whites to come surging from the shadows. Nearby, Brienne of Tarth and Podrick Payne stooped over a small group of corpses, carefully freeing them of personal tokens so they might be identified. Everything was a testament to the terrible cost of the victory. Jon brushed a hand over Longclaw's pommel, feeling the cool shape of the wolf's head. The steel had cut through the Night King, but at such a high price. He thought of the days ahead, the time it would take to rebuild the walls, to bury or burn the dead, to feed and care for all these survivors. Winter might linger yet, though it felt as if the darkest storm of that season had passed. He gazed across the courtyard and found Daenerys looking at him, her eyes reflecting the flames. She gave a subtle nod, beckoning him over. He tread slowly, avoiding patches of blackened ice or half-buried bodies. Ghost padded behind him, warily eyeing the flickering pyres. When he reached her, Daenerys slowly stood. Her face was streaked with ash, and there was a haunted look in her violet eyes. The moment he stood close, she reached out and took his hand. "I sent scouts to the outskirts," she said. "They report no further sign of whites. Every last one seems to have collapsed when the Night King fell." She paused, swallowing hard. "Viserion, his body remains out there, rotted. Drogon circled overhead for a time, but I called him down. He's resting outside the shattered gates. Regal is gone." Her voice broke, recalling the dragon she had lost before the final battle. Jon squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sorry." She closed her eyes. "They're dragons, the last dragons, and we nearly lost them all. Sometimes I feel like the gods or the fates have been toying with me, letting me taste triumph only to snatch it away. But then I think of everyone else here, Everyone who's lost so much more. My dragon was dear to me, yet so many mothers lost their children. So many children lost their parents. I'm trying to find comfort in the thought that we did what we had to do. Jon didn't know what to say. He thought about his own mother, whoever she was, and the father he'd known. He thought about his siblings, about the father who had raised him, about Ygritte, about the many people he'd lost. We did what we had to, he agreed softly. That doesn't make it any less painful. Silence hovered between them, broken only by the crackle of the fires. Finally, Jorah Mormont cleared his throat. We'll need a council soon, he said, voice rasping with fatigue. There's the question of how many remain fit to fight, how many are injured, whether the larders have enough stores to carry us through the rest of winter. And there's also the matter of the realm. If Queen Cersei yet sits the Iron Throne, we need to. Daenerys's face grew taut. Yes, she said, turning her gaze southward. Cersei will not have halted her schemes. But we have to account for our dead and wounded before we even think about marching. We need time to rebuild. And the North has endured too many losses. I'd rather not lead them into another slaughter. Not so soon. Jon felt a twinge of guilt at the mention of the realm. Before the battle, they had all been so focused on the threat from the North that they scarcely had time to plan for what came after. We'll meet. We'll decide together, he said. But you're right. The North is in no shape for another war. He remembered the endless line of undead outside these walls. So many had died. Only a fraction of the original fighting force remained. Cersei might try to take advantage of our weakened state. She might, Daenerys agreed grimly. But if she does, we'll make do. We always have. Her expression softened. Jon, we should talk more about what comes next. Not just in war, but in... She paused, searching his face as though uncertain how to proceed. I know who you are. I know what it means for you, and for me. Jon stiffened, recalling the truth about his parentage. He was Aegon Targaryen, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, if one believed in lines of succession. He had never wanted that. Now, after the horrors they had faced, the crown felt more meaningless than ever. I don't know what it means, he said quietly. Does it matter? Let's not speak of that yet. We have too many urgent needs. People are starving, freezing, and mourning. Let them see us united. Daenerys nodded. Then united we shall be. Her eyes flicked down to Ghost, who stood patiently at Jon's side. She reached to scratch behind his ear, and Ghost allowed it, though his gaze shifted, still wary of the surrounding fires. They moved away from the pyres at last, letting the caretakers finish the grim work. Along the ruined ramparts, a handful of men and women stood watch, though there was scarcely a need for watchfulness now. The monstrous army that had threatened all life was gone, reduced to dust and shattered ice. Still, old habits died hard, and the vow to never be taken by surprise had been seared into the hearts of every warrior. In the courtyard, Tormund spotted them and trundled over, red beard bristling in the cold. We're pulling the last bodies from under the collapsed gate, he announced. His voice was subdued, though he mustered a half-hearted smile. Lost a good friend there. Styr, one of our best trackers. The Whites tried to drag him off, but the Wolves got there first. Found him too late, though. He was a stubborn one, but not stubborn enough to keep his blood in. He shook his head, then laid a hand on Jon's shoulder. I was going to ask you about the Wolves, but I figure you know as little as the rest of us. Still, it was a sight I'll not soon forget. The old gods, the new gods, whichever gods, someone was with us last night. Jon nodded. They saved us. We can't repay them for that. But it seems they've moved on. Only Ghost remains here. Tormund grunted. Aye, the big wolves didn't linger long. Some men said they heard them howling through the night, running off into the dark. Mayhaps they'll roam the north again, or vanish altogether. But it was something, all right. He glanced at Daenerys, bowed his head in deference. We'll gather for that council soon, I take it. I'll be there. I'm no lord, but I know these lands, and there's a lot that needs doing. Daenerys gave him a faint, genuine smile. Thank you, Tormund Giantbane. Your wisdom is welcome. He chuckled, though the sound lacked its usual hearty gusto. Wisdom from a wildling? Now that's a first. But I'll take it. He clapped Jon on the shoulder and returned to the grim tasks at hand, hauling corpses to the pyres. Jon looked to Daenerys. We should get started. They gathered in what remained of the great hall of Winterfell. Much of the roof had collapsed near the southwestern corner, leaving a gaping hole where snow drifted in. The tables were charred from the fires that had been used as a defensive measure during the siege. Yet there was enough space to convene. Torches lined the walls, providing some light and a modicum of warmth. A handful of surviving lords, ladies, and officers assembled. Sansa Stark and Arya arrived together, huddled in thick cloaks. Davos Seaworth limped in on his makeshift crutch. Brienne of Tarth, stoic and grim, stood near the back with Podrick by her side. Tyrion Lannister, pale from shock and lack of sleep, arrived moments later, glancing around as though uncertain of the welcome he'd receive. Drogon's roar outside signaled that the dragons still prowled the castle's perimeter, warily keeping watch for any threat. The notion that he was now the only dragon left in Daenerys' service weighed heavily on everyone's minds, though no one dared voice it outright. At the head of the hall, Daenerys took a seat, more like collapsed into it, rubbing her temples. Jon stood beside her, arms crossed, while Ghost sat at his feet, resting his muzzle on his paws. Sansa cast the direwolf a cautious look. She was no stranger to wolves, having once had Lady, but the sight of Ghost's massive form, blood still crusting his white fur, was both comforting and unsettling. Arya's eyes flicked from Ghost to Jon, a spark of recognition there for the bond they shared. Daenerys spoke first, her voice subdued but steady. "We've survived the long night. The White Walkers are gone. Thanks to circumstances none of us fully understand. The direwolves turned the tide. But victory has come at a steep price. Our armies are decimated. Winterfell is in ruins. The larders are nearly empty. If we do not find a way to gather supplies soon, we'll face another kind of death." Sansa stepped forward. The North's harvest was already poor before we bent our efforts to the war. Many of our storehouses were burned or looted. White Harbor and the other ports might send supplies up the King's Road, but travel is difficult in winter, especially with the roads so churned by battles and corpses. Still, we have no choice. We must request what aid we can from the Southern Ords or from the Vale, anything to keep our people from starving. The Vale remains relatively untouched by these events, so perhaps Lord Royce can organize caravans. Tyrion, standing a few paces away, cleared his throat. "And from the Crownlands as well, if they'll send anything. But that leads us to Cersei. She has not forgotten our last confrontation. She might be willing to offer aid, at a price we cannot accept." Daenerys' eyes flashed. "We do not kneel to Cersei. She refused to help us when all humanity was threatened. We can't forget that. Once we recover, we will address that matter. But now we must rebuild. We must ensure that no child here starves come midwinter." Davos nodded, leaning on his crutch. "We have to see how many men are fit to travel. Some will need to go south to bargain for supplies. We might not have gold to spare, but the North still has other resources, furs, timber, perhaps metals from the mountains. It's not going to be easy. With the winter roads, even a short journey can become treacherous." Arya spoke quietly. "We should also consider any remnants of the Night King's magic. Just because the White Walkers collapsed doesn't mean... Well, I've learned to be cautious. There could be pockets of undead still wandering. Or worse." She looked at Jon and Daenerys with an intensity that suggested she did not trust miracles at face value. Jon inclined his head. "We'll send out scouts. We can have Ghost and the other wolves, if any remain, help us search, though they seem to have vanished. If there are any leftover whites, we'll know soon. But I suspect that, with the Night King's destruction, the force animating them is gone." The conversation turned to practicalities. How many rations were left, how to repair the castle gates, what to do with the thousands of corpses still littering the plains outside the walls. Tormund arrived halfway through, dragging a battered bench so he could sit, wincing at every movement. The big man had a wound on his calf, hastily bandaged. He muttered about the cost of this victory, naming wildlings who had died, cursing the entire notion of kings and queens. Yet at the same time, he appeared relieved that, for now, the biggest threat was cleaning up the aftermath rather than fending off an unstoppable enemy. After an hour or more of back-and-forth discussion, the group agreed on the immediate steps. Burn the dead, salvage what supplies could be found, dispatch a few ravens to White Harbor, the Vale, and even to some of the riverlands, pleading for relief. As the meeting drew to a close, most departed with heavy hearts, though some glimmer of relief shone in their eyes. They were alive. That alone was a monumental gift. Daenerys lingered, slumped in her seat, eyes half-lidded. Tyrion hovered nearby, looking at her with something like concern. "Your Grace," he said softly, "you need rest." She sighed. "We all need rest. But there's still so much to do." Jon approached. "He's right. You're exhausted." For a moment, she looked ready to protest. Then her shoulders sagged. "Very well. I'll find a bedchamber that's still intact." She stood, offering Tyrion a shaky smile. "You too, Lord Tyrion. We can speak more when we've regained our strength." Tyrion offered a slight bow, but instead of leaving, he turned to Jon. "A word, if I may." Jon nodded. Ghost rose, yawning, and padded after Daenerys as she left, presumably to seek a corner of Winterfell that still had a roof overhead. Tyrion gestured toward the broken window where a swirl of cold air poured in. "Jon? Or should I say, Aegon?" Jon stiffened. "I'd prefer Jon." Tyrion shrugged. "As you wish, Jon. I just wanted to clear the air. I know what it means that you might have a stronger claim to the throne than Daenerys. I also know you never asked for it. I suspect this whole matter is the last thing you want to worry about when you have half a kingdom's worth of problems already." Jon rubbed his jaw. "I'm tired, Tyrion. Tired of crowns and claims and politics. If you must know, I'm not going to press any claim. Daenerys is queen. I swore my loyalty to her. That hasn't changed." Tyrion's eyes flicked with curiosity. "Even now, when you stand as the hero who slew the Night King, with half the realm's survivors singing your praises?" Jon gave him a hard look. "She also fought for the living. She lost Regal and half her armies. Don't make it seem as though I alone bear credit for this victory. We all did it, men, women, direwolves, dragons. And we lost enough. I have no desire to add to that toll by starting a conflict over a crown I don't want." Tyrion stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I see. Good. For what it's worth, I believe you. Just be mindful that others may try to rally around you. People do love a hero, especially one who wants nothing in return. If you need advice on how to navigate that, well, I've had experience dealing with illusions of power." He smiled faintly, though his eyes held sadness. "But I'm glad we had this talk." Jon sighed. "I appreciate your concern. Right now, I just want to focus on helping these people survive." Tyrion placed a hand on Jon's arm, then departed. Jon lingered a moment, looking at the battered hall. His footsteps echoed on the stone. He felt as if he were drifting between worlds, caught in a space where the greatest threat of his life had been ended in a single stroke, yet the scars it left behind might never fully heal. He emerged into the courtyard, blinking against the pale daylight. The funeral pyres had dwindled, many of them now heaps of ash, though more bodies still awaited burning. A few men and women toiled at clearing rubble from the main gate. The main keep's architecture stood battered, blackened by dragonfire where Drogon had unleashed flame on a wave of whites, and Daenerys had tried to hold the outer walls. Winter's hush lay upon it all, and though the battle was won, the entire scene bore the imprint of unimaginable violence. Nearby, Arya was seated on a large chunk of fallen masonry, turning a small dagger over in her hands. She looked up as Jon approached, a flicker of relief in her expression. "You've grown quiet," she said, though her tone was gentle. "Quieter than usual, even." Jon gave a faint shrug. "A lot on my mind." She nodded, slipping the dagger into a sheath at her belt. "I keep thinking about it, the direwolves. 3,000 or more, all answering your call. It was you, wasn't it, or Ghost, or both of you? I don't believe it was a coincidence. We used to joke that you were half-wolf back when you and Robb and Theon found that litter of pups in the snow. Now I wonder if there was some truth in it. That maybe you do share some deeper bond with them." Jon glanced at Ghost, who had trotted up behind him. The direwolf's ears flicked as if he heard the mention of his name. "I don't know," Jon said. "I never called them. But I felt something when they arrived, like the old gods were stirring. Ghost and I, we've always had a bond. But that many direwolves," he shook his head. "It's beyond my understanding." Arya studied him, her gray eyes intent. You remember how old Nan used to say that in the days of the first men, the direwolves were guardians of the forest, protectors of the north, and the children of the forest. Perhaps we only glimpsed that ancient truth last night. It may be so, Jon admitted. If they've returned to wherever they came from, I doubt we'll ever know the full story. Arya rose, brushing stray bits of rubble from her cloak. Well, they did their part and we did ours. The rest is up to us. I'm glad you made it through, Jon. He pulled her into a hug. She stiffened at first, still not used to open affection, but then relaxed, hugging him back. In that moment, he was overwhelmed by gratitude that they were both alive. He remembered when she had been a tiny girl playing with wooden swords in the courtyard or chasing cats around the corridors. Too much had changed, but they were still here. After a moment, she pulled away, clearing her throat. Go on, she said, nudging him gently. I think Sansa's looking for you. Something about supply ledgers. He nodded and took his leave. Indeed, he found Sansa near the burned stables, directing a few stable hands to salvage what hay remained for horses. She turned to him, brow knitted, and asked him a dozen questions about the extent of their losses. Jon answered as best he could. How many Dothraki remained? Precious few. How many Unsullied had survived? Fewer than half, he guessed. How many wildlings Tormund had accounted for? It felt like an endless litany of grim facts, but she calmly recorded them, determined to piece together the means of their survival. In times of crisis, Sansa's practical mind shone like a steady candle in a dark corridor. When the conversation ended, she placed a gentle hand on Jon's forearm. I'm proud of you, she said, voice quiet. Whatever else happens, I'm proud to call you my brother. His throat constricted. Thank you. I'm proud of you too. Sansa's lips curved into a sad smile. We'll have to plan a better future. One that doesn't revolve around wars and the dead. If we can rebuild Winterfell, maybe it'll once again be a place of safety. He wanted to share her optimism, though a small part of him worried about further conflict, about Cersei, about the cracks in their alliances, about the tension that might arise when word of his true parentage spread. But for that moment, he let her gentle hope soothe him. We'll try, he said. We owe them that much. Time rolled on in a blur of backbreaking labor and quiet mourning. Over the next few days, more funeral pyres were lit until the entire area around Winterfell was dotted with smoking pillars. The weather, though cold, seemed oddly calmer, as if the ferocious storms that once battered them had spent their fury alongside the Night King's fall. Men and women scavenged the battlefield for weapons or items that might be repaired. The stables that had been partially saved now housed not just horses but a few battered wagons, which were loaded with the personal belongings of the deceased. People wanted to keep something from those they loved. All this while, Ghost stayed by Jon's side. When Jon ventured out beyond the walls, be it to check the perimeter or to oversee the clearing of corpses, Ghost padded quietly alongside, nose testing the air for any lingering threats. Sometimes, Jon sensed the big white wolf searching for something in the distance, ears pricking at the faintest sounds. Now and then, Ghost would lift his muzzle and let out a short, yearning howl. No reply came. Whatever band of dire wolves had aided them, they seemed to have returned to the deep wilderness. Jon tried not to feel abandoned, yet he couldn't help wondering what strange force had drawn them there that night, only to vanish afterward. One afternoon, as the sun hovered low behind thick clouds, Jon joined Daenerys at a vantage point atop one of the more stable sections of wall. From there, they could see for miles across the snowy expanse. The ice-locked river glimmered faintly, and in the far distance loomed forests, dark and impenetrable. Broken shards of weapons, the remnants of the undead, and the bodies of fallen soldiers still marred the outer fields. Crews of men were working in the cold to gather those remains for burning. Daenerys stood there, shoulders shrouded in a heavy cloak, arms crossed against the wind. Drogon perched nearby, curled like a giant cat among the toppled stones, smoke coiling from his nostrils. She turned as Jon approached, offering a tired smile. Have you rested? She asked. Jon shook his head. Enough to keep going. She nodded. I can't sleep well either. Every time I close my eyes, I see the battle. The whites, the cold, the sense of endless dread. Even though it's over, I can't shake that feeling. Jon leaned against the parapet, looking over the fields. I know. We were so close to the end. Part of me still feels like this is just a pause, that something else will come lurking from the shadows. He exhaled, breath fogging. But we can't let fear rule us. We have to move forward. She turned her gaze out to the horizon. Agreed. I was thinking of sending word to the North's remaining houses, House Manderly, House Glover, the Umber's lands if any remain, to gather here, to plan how to rebuild collectively. There's more strength in unity, and if the North is truly loyal to the House Stark and to me, they'll come. He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. Yes, that's wise. But the North is proud and many may blame you for the losses we suffered. They'll need reassurance. You brought dragons and an army, but some might claim that you also brought destruction. She stiffened, a flash of anger in her eyes. Then she bowed her head. I know I can't force them to bend the knee in gratitude. But I gave everything for this battle. We all did. Perhaps they'll see reason. If they don't, I'll try another way. I'm learning that conquest and fear are not the only paths to loyalty. Jon studied her. There was a kind of resignation in her posture, a humility he had rarely glimpsed. She had lost much, regal, a good portion of her armies and the illusions of unstoppable power she once carried. Yet in that loss, she seemed steadier, more aware of the realm's fragility. You're changing, he said softly. She looked at him. How do you mean? You're different than when we first met. You've always been strong, determined, but there's more caution in your eyes now. Less certainty, maybe? She gave a bitter smile. I've learned that not even dragons and a birthright can guarantee success. I've learned that the living world is more complicated than I imagined from across the sea. And I've learned that trusting people can be as powerful as fear in its own way. This battle taught me that. She paused, searching his face. What about you, Jon? How have you changed? He sighed, recalling how he once stood on the wall, a boy who knew only the bitter wind and the vow he'd sworn. I never wanted power. I never wanted a crown. I just wanted to do what was right. But I've also made mistakes, allying with men who betrayed me, trusting when I should have been cautious, or being too cautious when I should have trusted. Now that this war is over, I'm not sure where I fit. Her hand found his. You fit by my side. Let's rebuild first and foremost. Then we'll face what's next together. He nodded, struck by the warmth in her gaze. Together. Over the next fortnight, ravens arrived from White Harbor bearing messages of tentative support, along with meager shipments of dried fish and grain. Lord Glover, who had once refused to fight, sent an apologetic note admitting he should have heeded the call earlier. Supplies trickled in from the Vale, though the roads were treacherous and the caravans had to be escorted by knights and wildlings. The North was beginning to rally, if only in the first cautious steps toward collective recovery. The days were cold, but the storms had lost their ferocity. Gray skies hovered, shedding occasional flurries of snow that blanketed the ruins. More repairs sprang to life, makeshift wooden supports propped up damaged walls, while workers climbed precarious scaffolds to patch holes in the roofs. Blacksmiths toiled day and night, forging nails, repairing swords, hammering out dents in battered shields. Children ran errands, carrying messages or food to the laborers, and in the evenings the great hall, still missing half a roof, echoed with the faint hum of voices sharing meager meals. On one such evening, Jon found himself seated on a broken bench near the hall's large hearth. A fire crackled there, welcome heat on a frigid night. He was cradling a cup of watered wine in his hands, exhaustion evident in his posture. Across from him sat Tormund, happily quaffing an ale that someone had scrounged up from the remains of Winterfell's stores. Gendry huddled near, fiddling with a metal piece, some kind of improved dragonglass arrowhead, though the whites no longer posed a threat. Arya crouched on the floor, whittling something from a scrap of wood. Tormund smacked his lips, setting his tankard down with a belch. Now this is living, he joked, though the corners of his eyes were pained. Not enough ale to fill a mouse's belly, no roast to sink my teeth into, half the roof missing. Still, I'm alive to complain about it. Jon couldn't help a slight smile. It's an improvement over the alternative, I suppose. Gendry looked at his arrowhead, turning it in the firelight. Hard to believe it's over, he said quietly. For so long, all I could think about was forging weapons that might save us. And now that the threat is gone, I don't know what to do with myself. Arya glanced up. Live, she said simply. That's what's left to do. Live, forge new weapons, find new foes, or maybe find none at all if we're lucky. Tormund snorted. There's always a foe somewhere. That's the problem with humans, we can't seem to live without sticking swords in each other's guts. Jon leaned forward, swirling the watered wine in his cup. Let's hope we can avoid that for a while. We need peace. Arya raised an eyebrow. And if Cersei marches north? He sighed. Then we'll face that when it comes. But maybe she won't. Maybe she'll wait. She's cunning, not foolish. She knows we're battered. She might bide her time, hoping we bleed out on our own. Either way, we'll be ready. A gust of wind swept through the hall, rattling loose timbers and sending sparks dancing from the fire. The four of them fell silent, each lost in private thoughts. Outside, the night stretched on, still eerily quiet, as if the land itself hesitated to reclaim normalcy after so much horror. Weeks passed. Under Daenerys's direction and with Sansa's organizational skills, Winterfell took the first tentative steps toward something resembling stability. A trickle of refugees arrived from smaller holdfasts, drawn by the promise of any leftover supplies or the chance to huddle behind walls, even if those walls were half-collapsed. The combined efforts of unsullied discipline and northern grit managed to clear away much of the rubble, patch the gates, and erect new defenses. Wildlings, guided by Tormund, scouted the perimeters, ensuring no straggling pockets of undead threatened them. As the days grew into a month, life resumed a fragile rhythm. Burial mounds dotted the landscape, and the great hall's partially ruined walls bore witness to countless solemn vigils. But every day the sun rose felt like a gift, a reassurance that the long night had truly passed. If the North had to endure more winters, at least they would endure them alive and free from the terror that once loomed. It was during one such day, when the sky was a lighter gray than usual, that a commotion arose near the gates. Jon, who had been conferring with a group of laborers about reinforcing the walls, looked up to see a rider galloping into the courtyard. The horse snorted, flanks heaving with lather as its rider, a young man in the colors of House Glover, nearly toppled off from exhaustion. Jon rushed over, catching the bridle to steady the animal. "What is it?" Jon asked. "Speak, man," the youth gasped, eyes wild. "Bandits, M-Lord. Or something. They're attacking the supply caravans on the western road. We lost 4 wagons of grain. They rode in with black hoods, crossbows. Killed half our men before we could escape." Jon felt a flare of anger. "Where? How many?" "At least 20, maybe more. We never saw them until it was too late. They took the wagons, the oxen, everything. I barely got away." By now, others had gathered around, including Davos, Arya, and several of the Northmen. Daenerys arrived moments later, tension in her gaze. Jon repeated the news, and anger flashed in her eyes. "We can't lose those supplies," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "We're barely scraping by as it is." Davos frowned. "Bandits might be desperate small folk, or they could be mercenaries. The roads are rife with trouble." Daenerys shook her head. "I've seen what desperation looks like, and it rarely comes so organized. This must be something else. We need to stop them, or every caravan will be in danger." Jon nodded, jaw set. "We'll form a scouting party, track them down. We have to recover what they stole if possible. And we can't allow them to keep raiding or we'll starve come next moon." He set about gathering a small force. A handful of northern riders led by Royce of the Vale, a few wildlings who knew how to move swiftly over snowy terrain, and some unsullied for discipline. Arya insisted on coming. Jon resisted at first, but she refused to budge. Tormund, too, volunteered, though he was still limping slightly. Then Daenerys stepped forward. "I'm coming with you," she said. Jon hesitated. "You're the queen. If something goes wrong..." She gave him a look that brooked no argument. "I'm tired of sitting in half-ruined halls while others risk their lives. I still have Drogon. He can scout from the sky if need be." Her gaze swept the assembled men. "Though we must be wary of any hidden scorpions or ballistae, if these bandits have cunning. The last thing I want is to lose Drogon too." In the end, she joined them. They prepared swiftly, layering warm clothing beneath their armor, packing rations, sharpening weapons. Ghost followed Jon without question, ignoring any attempts to keep him behind. By mid-morning, they rode out, the gates creaking open behind them. A half-frozen wind scoured their faces. The party numbered about 25 in total, a small but capable band. Drogon soared overhead, a majestic shadow that drifted through the low clouds. Villagers who had taken shelter near Winterfell's courtyard watched them depart with a mixture of hope and dread. They rode west, following the main road that wound around snow-covered fields and small copses of bare-branched trees. Here and there, they saw old battle sites, rotted carcasses of undead, half-buried under drifts, or burned-out wagons from earlier skirmishes. Birds circled overhead, cawing. The silence was occasionally broken by the flap of Drogon's wings or the snort of a horse. After hours of travel, they found the spot where the supply caravan had been ambushed. Broken wagon wheels lay strewn about, stained red from the blood that had melted through the snow. The bodies of a few men, arms stiff in death, remained. A sense of outrage welled up in Jon's chest. They had survived the army of the dead, only for their people to be murdered by other humans, likely out of greed. Arya knelt by one corpse, examining the coral lodged in the man's side. She tugged it free and held it up. Crossbow bolt, standard design. Nothing fancy, no crest. Could be from anywhere. She handed it to Jon. He studied it. The wood was dark, the tip crude. No sign of origin. He glanced at the ground. Tracks leading west. Shallow impressions in the snow. They left in a hurry, he observed. But they had enough men to drive off or kill the guards. We should follow. Tormund pointed to the horizon. Looks like there's a line of woods. They might be holed up there. They pressed on. Daenerys, astride a pale mare, kept glancing skyward where Drogon circled, watchful. Now and then, she urged him to fly further ahead. The big dragon soared to the treetops, scanning for signs of movement. The mood was tense, each rider gripping weapons tight. Ghost loped alongside Jon's horse, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or paw at footprints. His ears flattened once or twice, picking up faint scents. By late afternoon, they spotted smoke rising from the edge of the forest. The group pulled up behind a small ridge. Tyrion wasn't there, he had remained behind. But Jon imagined the hand would have advised caution. A quick scout forward revealed a small encampment. A few tents nestled among the trees, wagons with battered tarps, and men moving around a central fire. Jon and Arya crept close, concealed by snowy underbrush, to assess the numbers. She counted perhaps 30 men armed with swords and crossbows. The stolen wagons, recognized by their northern markings, were lined up, and a handful of oxen were tethered nearby. Jon felt a twist of disgust. These men might just be opportunists, but they had killed innocents and stolen precious supplies that could save hundreds of lives in Winterfell. He and Arya withdrew quietly, rejoining Daenerys and the others. We outnumber them slightly, Jon said, keeping his voice low. But they're entrenched. Attacking head-on would be messy. Arya's lips tightened. We can flank them. I can slip around the back, pick off their sentries, create chaos. Then the main group can charge in. Daenerys shook her head. That's dangerous. We have Drogon. We could overwhelm them quickly, but I don't want to burn the wagons. Jon weighed the options. We need those supplies intact. A full Dracarys would be too risky, but Drogon could serve as a distraction. If we approach from two directions, the bandits might panic and flee. Daenerys met his gaze. We have to try. Are you with me, Jon? He nodded. Always. Within minutes, they devised a plan. Arya, Tormund, and a handful of wildlings would circle the perimeter, taking out any lookouts quietly. Then Daenerys would ride Drogon overhead, roaring and making a show of force, drawing the bandits' attention. Meanwhile, Jon, along with the rest of their fighters, would charge directly into the camp, relying on surprise and the bandits' terror of dragons. If all went well, they could recapture the supplies without burning them. They spread out, everyone taking position with tense efficiency. Arya slipped into the shadows with Tormund, the big wildling surprisingly adept at stealth when he needed to be. Daenerys dismounted, placing a hand on Drogon's flank. The dragon lowered himself, allowing her to climb onto his back, though she did so carefully, mindful of the thick snow and the battered harness. Jon gave her a brief nod, and she managed a tight smile in return. Then Drogon launched skyward, snow swirling in the downdraft of his massive wings. The thunder of his takeoff echoed through the valley, certain to catch the bandits' attention. Jon waited with Ghost and the others, hearts pounding, as Drogon ascended above the treetops and let out a roar that shook the air. Within the bandit camp, men scrambled. Jon watched from cover as they looked up, pointing crossbows at the sky. A few tried to hide under wagons. Others simply stood there, mouths agape. Before they could rally, Arya's group struck from the rear, silent as winter foxes. Jon saw one bandit topple forward, an arrow in his throat, while another collapsed under Tormund's axe. Shouts of alarm rose. Chaos erupted. Now, Jon hissed, kicking his horse into a gallop. He led the charge over the ridge. The men behind him hollered battle cries. Ghost bounded ahead, white fur flashing like a phantom. The pounding of hooves on hard-packed snow seemed to jar the entire forest. The bandits' leader, a tall man in black leathers, turned with wide eyes. He raised a crossbow aiming at Jon, but Ghost slammed into him before he could fire. The crossbow bolt went off harmlessly into the air. Jon raced forward, longclaw in hand, barreling into a knot of bandits who were fumbling for their swords. His first slash disarmed one, sending the man reeling with a scream. Another tried to stab Jon's horse, but a swift stroke of Valyrian steel ended that threat. The horse whinnied, rearing, but Jon guided it forward, heart-thundering. Overhead, Drogon swooped, unleashing a deafening roar. Flames danced at the edges of his jaws, but Daenerys held him back from spitting fire onto the wagons. Instead, the dragon circled lower, smashing the tops of the trees with his tail, scattering pine needles and snow. Terror gripped the bandits. Some dropped their weapons and ran for the thicker woods only to be chased down by wildlings or cut off by Unsullied. A few stood their ground, loosing bolts at Drogon, but the bolts glanced off the dragon's scaled hide harmlessly. He roared again, shaking the canopy. The fight was short and brutal. Those who resisted were slain, and those who yielded were disarmed and tied. Jon spotted Arya darting between wagons, her blade flashing. Tormund bellowed with fierce glee, smashing men's heads with the flat of his axe. One crossbowman took aim at Daenerys above, but an unsullied spear found his throat before he could shoot. Within minutes, it was over. The camp lay strewn with bodies and shattered tents. A handful of bandits, perhaps 7 or 8, knelt in the snow, hands bound, guarded by Unsullied with spears pressed close. Jon dismounted, breath heaving in great white clouds, longclaw dripping red. Ghost panted by his side, muzzle stained with blood, though the direwolf seemed unhurt. Daenerys landed Drogon in a rush of wind and snow, the great beast huffing as if exasperated by the minor threat these men had posed. Jon scanned for Arya. He saw her wiping her blade on a scrap of cloth, ice sharp. She nodded at him once. They had succeeded with minimal harm to their group. A few minor injuries, nothing more. He turned to Daenerys. We've taken back the supplies. The wagons seem intact. She exhaled, relief warring with a colder emotion when she regarded the kneeling captives. They murdered our people. Now they beg for mercy. Jon cast his gaze on them. Some were trembling, others wore expressions of defiance. The tall leader cradled a wounded arm, grimacing in pain. Jon asked, "Who leads you?" The tall one spat in the snow. "We lead ourselves. There's no law in this frozen wasteland, so we take what we need." Daenerys' eyes hardened. "Is that what you tell yourself while you slit innocent throats for a few sacks of grain?" She slid off Drogon's back, boots crunching on the snow. Drogon loomed over her, letting out a low rumble that made the men flinch. "We didn't mean to kill nobody," one younger bandit mumbled. But they fought back. The men in the wagons, they had weapons. "We were hungry." Jon's anger flared. "So you chose to murder innocent men? Steel supplies meant to keep people alive through winter." The tall leader sneered. "And I suppose you're so pure? You highborn lords and ladies, you take what you want. You starve the small folk so your fancy houses can flourish. We just did the same as you." His words were filled with bitterness. Daenerys looked at Jon. Her expression asked the question without words, what do we do with them? They had no prison wagon, no well-guarded dungeon this far from Winterfell. Leaving them alive meant risking another raid somewhere else. Executing them outright was swift, perhaps just, but also brutal. After all, these were living men, not mindless wights. Jon sighed. The old question of mercy and justice. He remembered how Ned Stark would pass the sentence himself, how he'd always taught that if a lord condemned a man to die, the lord should swing the sword personally. But these men were beyond simple theft, they had killed the innocent during a time of desperate need. That was a grave crime in any code. "They must face justice," Jon murmured. Daenerys nodded. Her gaze swept the men, and he saw the steel in her eyes that once made her a conqueror of cities. "Very well," she said. "You stand accused of murder, theft, and endangering the North's people in a time of dire crisis. The punishment for such crimes is death. Does anyone speak in your defense?" Silence, broken only by the moan of the wind. One man spat, another cursed. No words of defense were offered. Daenerys drew in a breath. Then the sentences passed. Some of the captives began to beg, but the tall leader glared at them as though daring them to grovel. Daenerys glanced at Jon, a question in her eyes. He nodded solemnly, stepping forward with longclaw. The Unsullied forced the men to kneel. One by one, Jon delivered the execution, recalling the vow of old, the one who passes the sentence should swing the sword. The bandits died quickly, their blood dark on the snow. Ghost watched, ears back, yet silent. When it was done, Daenerys exhaled shakily as though the weight of the moment crushed her. Once she might have used dragonfire for a grim spectacle. Now she chose a simpler, more direct form of justice, perhaps out of respect for the supplies they needed, or perhaps because she no longer relished displays of raw power. Arya stood by, eyes unreadable, while Tormund quietly ran a hand through his red beard, saying nothing. The living carried their own brand of horror, distinct from the undead. Jon wiped Longclaw on a patch of snow, feeling numb. "We'll burn the bodies," he said, voice thick with fatigue. "We can't let them attract wolves or worse." Daenerys nodded, turning to the wagons. "At least we have the grain. Let's load it back up, then return to Winterfell as soon as possible. Our people need it." She paused, looking at the stolen oxen. "We'll bring those too." They set to work. The Unsullied and wildlings gathered up the scattered crates and sacks, loading them onto the wagons. Drogon lay curled, flicking his tail, as though bored by the entire proceeding. Now and then he lifted his head to watch the workers with a lazy rumble. Arya and Tormund scouted around the campsite, checking for anything worth salvaging. Jon supervised, refusing to let himself dwell on the men he had just slain. This was the reality of survival. Mercy to bandits meant a death sentence for innocents. Night began to fall before they finished. The forest darkened and snow drifted more thickly. Daenerys ordered a small fire built to warm the workers, but they kept it modest so as not to draw unwanted attention. They posted sentries, dividing the night into watch shifts. Jon offered to take the first shift. He needed to clear his head. He stood on the outskirts of the camp, Ghost at his side. The night was quiet except for the wind in the bare branches overhead. Daenerys slept near Drogon, using the dragon's vast warmth to ward off the cold. Arya found a spot near a wagon, curled in her cloak, blade within reach. Tormund snored loudly from under a makeshift lean-to. A few Unsullied guarded the perimeter. The rest of the party dozed, exhausted. Jon stared up at the sky, searching for stars. The clouds obscured most, but a few faint pinpricks of light blinked overhead. He listened to Ghost's soft breathing, thinking of all that had transpired since the long night. Already, fresh conflicts arose, reminding him that the world's cruelty did not vanish with the dead. Yet he held onto the sliver of hope that they could build a better future. Hours passed in silence. When Jon roused Arya for her shift, she stood, rubbing her eyes and muttering a joke about how it was easier to fight the undead than to sleep on frozen ground. Jon managed a tired chuckle, passing her the watch. He found a spot near the wagons, lowering himself onto a bedroll. Ghost settled at his feet, providing a comforting presence. Despite the tension, exhaustion claimed Jon within moments. They rose at dawn, promptly hitching the oxen to the wagons and heading back for Winterfell. The journey was slow, the roads slippery with ice, but they pressed on. Daenerys flew Drogon part of the way, scouting for any further threats. They passed a few abandoned farms, some half-collapsed, their inhabitants presumably fled or lost to the undead. A stark reminder of how shattered the realm remained. Still, the recovered grain and the victory over the bandits lifted their spirits. Each small success felt like a step toward reclaiming the world from chaos. At last, Winterfell's towers appeared on the horizon, battered but still standing. Smoke from the castle chimneys rose into the pale sky. A watchman on the gate spotted Drogon overhead and blew a horn, summoning the guards to open the gates. Jon led the wagons in, exhausted yet relieved to see the courtyard. Workers rushed forward, cheering at the sight of the reclaimed supplies. Sansa and Davos emerged from the keep, relief etched on their faces. Sansa's gaze lingered on the grain sacks like they were precious jewels. "Thank the gods," she breathed. "We heard about the ambush. We weren't sure if We're alive," Jon said, dismounting. "And we brought back everything." Davos clapped him on the back. "Well done, my boy. Well done." As Daenerys dismounted from Drogon's shoulder, the crowd of onlookers gazed at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Some, no doubt, still harbored reservations about a Targaryen queen in the north, but this day she was the reason they had food instead of hunger. She accepted no cheers or bows, simply directing the wagons toward the remaining storehouses. "Make sure this is distributed fairly," she told Sansa. "We can't afford hoarding or corruption." Sansa nodded. "Of course." Over the next few days, Winterfell settled into a precarious routine. The confiscated supplies helped stabilize their immediate crisis. People had enough to eat, if only barely. More refugees trickled in, seeking shelter and a chance to survive the winter. Daenerys welcomed them under a strict code. Everyone worked if they could. Some knitted blankets, others stoked fires or tended to the livestock that remained. The battered walls began to show signs of rudimentary repair. And though sorrow still clung to the castle like a shroud, a sense of unity also grew. These people had endured the worst night in living memory. They had seen the direwolves, the fall of the Night King. Together, they had taken their first steps into a world without that looming specter of ice-cold doom. Yet unease lingered. Whispers circulated about the direwolves, about the significance of such a supernatural event. Some rumor-mongers claimed Jon Snow commanded beasts of the forest. Others said Daenerys had conjured them with blood magic. More rational minds simply called it a miracle they couldn't explain. For his part, Jon found no answers in the Godwood or in restless dreams. He only knew that the wolves were gone, likely returned to some hidden domain. It was about 3 weeks after the final battle when a rider from the south brought tidings of fresh turmoil. Jon received him in the half-rebuilt Great Hall, where Daenerys, Tyrion, Sansa, Arya, and others listened intently. The rider knelt, face drawn from hard travel. "Your Grace," the man said, addressing Daenerys. "I come from the Riverlands. Reports say Lannister forces have begun to gather near Harrenhal. Word is they have new recruits, sells words from Essos. They say the gold from King's Landing flows freely." Murmurs spread through the hall. Daenerys's expression turned stony. "Cersei." Tyrion frowned, his voice subdued. "She's preparing for war. Or at least for an intimidation campaign." Sansa pressed her lips together. "The question is, will she march north, or will she try to fortify her positions until we're weakened by winter?" Jon looked at Daenerys, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "We can't let her gather strength unchecked. But we can't leave the north undefended. Our forces are still recovering." Daenerys drummed her fingers on the arm of her seat that was still scratched from the battle. "If she marches on us now, we might not withstand a full assault. Especially if she's hired fresh cells words. We could attempt diplomacy, but Cersei has proven she cannot be trusted." Tormund muttered a curse. "What is it with your southern queens? We've barely survived the dead, and now they want to kill each other again." Arya's voice was flat. "Better to strike first than wait for her to knock at our gates." Sansa cleared her throat. "We should also consider the Vale. Robin Arryn might lend us more knights if we can convince him the threat is real. We need time to gather allies, to muster whatever remains of the northern houses." Daenerys exhaled. "Then time is what we must buy. A direct confrontation now would be foolish, but letting her mass forces might be equally reckless. We need more information. Tyrion, can you reach out to any friends in King's Landing? Varys once had little birds everywhere." Tyrion rubbed his brow. "I'll try. Varys is gone though, and my own connections may be compromised. Still, I'll do what I can. If Cersei is forging alliances or buying Cells words, we need to know her timeline." Jon listened to the debate that followed with a heavy heart. There was no simple solution. They had survived an apocalyptic threat only to face the unending dance of political strife. In the corner, Ghost lay curled, occasionally twitching an ear at the rising voices. As the discussion continued, Jon caught Sansa's eye. She gave a subtle nod, and he knew they were both thinking the same thing. The North must not bleed again so soon. They had paid in blood to stop the dead. Now, they would have to shed more to keep a southern queen from their doorstep. However it played out, the realm's cycle of violence refused to end. Ultimately, Daenerys announced they would fortify Winterfell further, send envoys to the Vale and the Riverlands, and attempt to open negotiations with any houses loyal to her cause along the way. Meanwhile, Tyrion would try to glean more intelligence on Cersei's next move. The meeting ended with no decisive plan for war, only a vow to remain vigilant. That night, as the hush of winter fell again, Jon roamed the castle's battlements, half lost in thought. Ghost padded beside him, white fur glowing in the moonlight. He remembered the vow he made to himself after the battle with the Night King, that if they emerged victorious, perhaps they could build a kinder world. It seemed the dream was threatened by the harsh reality of politics and ambition. In the courtyard below, men and women gathered around modest fires, sharing thin stews and tales of the battle. Children huddled close to their mothers, eyes wide with wonder whenever they spoke of dire wolves and dragons. Somewhere in the gloom, someone strummed a lute, picking a mournful melody that drifted up to Jon's ears on the crisp night air. For all the heartbreak and uncertainty, this moment of fragile unity felt precious. He descended the steps, heading for the Godwood. Its ancient weirwood tree stood tall and silent, limbs bare in the winter cold. The carved face in the trunk regarded him with sightless eyes. Jon placed a hand on the bark, remembering how Bran once gazed upon such trees with secret knowledge. Bran was gone now, lost or departed on a journey beyond the ken of mortals, if the rumors were true. Or maybe he had died somewhere along the line. The realm's memory was incomplete. Ghost sniffed around the red roots, stepping lightly over the thin crust of snow. Jon closed his eyes, exhaling a long breath. "If any old gods are listening," he murmured, "thank you for saving us from the dead. I don't know why you sent the wolves, but thank you. He paused, his voice nearly lost in the rustle of dry branches. Help us find the strength to face what comes next. We're all so tired. His words faded into the stillness. No voice answered, no sign appeared. Just the quiet rush of wind through branches. And yet, Jon felt a tiny flicker of calm. He rose, turning to go. Ghost stopped, ears pricking, nose lifted to the air. Jon frowned, following his wolf's line of sight. At the far edge of the godwood, just beyond the ring of half-buried stones, stood a shape, a dark silhouette against the snow. At first, Jon thought it was a trick of the moonlight. Then he saw a pair of golden eyes gleam. Another dire wolf? He took a cautious step forward, heart pounding. The shape moved slightly, revealing the unmistakable outline of a massive wolf. It was not as large as Ghost, but still bigger than any normal wolf he had seen in the southern lands. Its fur was black as midnight, blending with the shadows of the godwood except for a faint streak of silver across its side. The wolf observed Jon and Ghost with an uncanny stillness, the tip of its tail twitching. For a moment, Jon felt pinned by that gaze. Could it be the same black dire wolf that fought alongside Ghost on the battlefield? One of those that answered the call to defeat the Night King? He held his breath, uncertain. Slowly, he raised a hand, showing he carried no threat. Ghost stood tense but not hostile, as though he recognized an ally. The black wolf took a step forward, silent as a ghost, nose testing the air. Jon watched it approach, half in awe. When it was a dozen paces away, it paused. Golden eyes flicked from Jon to Ghost, then back again. A low growl, not of aggression but of communication, rumbled in its throat. Ghost echoed the sound, taking a tentative step toward the newcomer. Then, as swiftly as it had appeared, the black wolf turned and bounded away, melting into the darkness beyond the trees. Jon rushed a few steps after it, calling out softly, but the creature was gone. Only footprints in the snow remained, a fleeting sign that something truly stood there. Ghost sniffed at the tracks, letting out a whine. Jon patted his wolf's flank, heart racing. Somehow that brief encounter filled him with both longing and wonder. The wolves were not entirely gone. Perhaps they still watched from the shadows, guardians of a realm that needed them. Or perhaps it had come to see Ghost one last time, a silent farewell. Jon felt a twinge of sadness as he looked at the disturbed snow. He turned to Ghost. They're still out there, he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Some of them, at least. The wind carried no reply, only the faint echo of the black wolf's paw steps lost in the night. But Jon felt a measure of reassurance, as though the old gods had granted him a sign that the dire wolves remained protectors even if from afar. In the following days, he found himself returning to the godwood, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ghost. He never again saw the black dire wolf, but now and then Ghost would prick his ears or sniff the air intently as though detecting an unseen presence. Jon told no one of the encounter, some part of him cherished it as a private piece of hope. Meanwhile, preparations for a potential southern war continued. Scouts came and went. A few ravens arrived bearing messages of uncertain loyalty from various lords. Some parted with small donations of grain or steel, but none declared open support for a renewed conflict. The realm was weary of war. The memory of the undead still lingered in every corner, fueling a desire for peace that clashed with the realities of power. Daenerys weighed each development carefully, conferring with Jon, Tyrion, and Sansa. Arya often stood by, silent, watchful, as though she scented betrayal on the wind. Tormund threatened to leave for the true north once the castle was secure, claiming the wildlings yearned to return beyond the wall. Yet he lingered, partly out of loyalty to Jon, partly because the promise of conflict in the south intrigued him. On a cloudy morning late in the season, another raven arrived, this time from King's Landing itself. The courier who bore it had traveled under a white banner, claiming an urgent message for the queen in the north. Inside the keep, Daenerys broke the seal with steady hands, surrounded by her advisors. She read the contents, her face darkening. "It's from Cersei," Daenerys said, letting the scroll roll shut. "She demands we bend the knee to her authority, or she will march north at the first thaw with an army of sellswords. She claims the Iron Throne by right and that we are nothing but usurpers perched in a crumbling fortress." A hush fell. Tyrion pursed his lips. "She's bold, I'll give her that. Her victory depends on our weakness. She must think the rumor of the Night King's defeat means we're exhausted." Jon exhaled. "We are exhausted." Daenerys set the scroll aside. "She gives me a month to respond. A month to agree to her terms, total submission, the handing over of all the North's resources to the crown, including me coming to King's Landing to atone for my rebellion. She says if I comply, she may spare the North's people. Otherwise—" Her voice trailed off, but none in the room needed her to finish. Sansa's eyes flashed. "You can't do that. Arya's hand was on her dagger, though she made no overt threat. If Cersei comes here, we'll fight her, no matter how battered we are. Tormund spat. Let her come. We'll give her the same welcome we gave the dead. Davos shook his head. We're not in shape for a long war. But bending the knee to that madwoman? Unthinkable. Daenerys drew in a long breath, then looked to Jon. What do you think, my king? Jon shifted uncomfortably. He knew the truth of his birth, that he was also a Targaryen by blood, but he had no desire to usurp Daenerys. Still, he could not avoid the question. We must call her bluff. We're not marching south yet, not until we're ready. Let her come if she dares. The snows aren't gone, and her men might starve on the roads. If she tries to besiege us, she'll find a fortress full of determined defenders. And a dragon. But we also can't ignore the possibility that she'll find some cunning method to strike at our weak points. Daenerys nodded slowly. Then we prepare. We won't march south, but we won't cower either. I'll send her a response that we do not submit. If she wants war, she can have it, but on our terms. Meanwhile, we continue to strengthen our alliances, gather resources, and rebuild. That is my decision. No one objected. The path ahead was clear, if treacherous. They would stand firm in the north, hope to weather the next storm, whether it came in weeks or months. The memory of the direwolf army lingered in many minds, a testament to the North's hidden strengths, though no one expected such a miracle a second time. That evening, Jon found Daenerys standing in the ruined courtyard under a sky heavy with clouds. She gazed at Winterfell's walls, the scaffolding, the half-finished repairs. Workers trudged through snow carrying beams. The hush of dusk enveloped them. Ghost trailed at Jon's heels as he approached. She heard his footsteps and turned. In the torchlight, her expression was resolute, but he saw the flicker of doubt beneath the surface. Sometimes, she began, voice soft, I wonder if I made a mistake ever crossing the sea. My dragons might still be alive, all three of them. My people in Meereen might be thriving. Instead, I came here and lost so much. Jon's heart ached at her words. If you hadn't come, we might all be dead under the Night King's army. She acknowledged that with a nod. I know. But part of me can't help longing for simpler battles. Instead, I face Cersei's cunning. The realm is broken, the north is half-ruined, and my dragons, only Drogon remains. Her shoulders trembled slightly. I wanted to break the wheel, Jon. But it feels like the wheel is breaking me. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're not alone, he said gently. We're in this together. She managed a small smile, tears brimming in her eyes. Thank you. They stood there in the courtyard for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. Snow drifted down, blanketing the rubble, muffling the noise of the night. The future loomed uncertain, a potential southern war, the slow rebuilding of the north, the fragile alliances holding them all together. But in that moment, they took solace in a quiet unity. From somewhere beyond the walls came a distant howl, soft, barely audible. Both of them froze. Ghost lifted his head, ears pricked as though listening. The howl came again, a lonely note carried on the wind, and then it faded. Jon felt a wave of bittersweet recognition. Another direwolf, maybe the same black wolf, roaming near the castle. Or perhaps just an echo in his mind, reminding him that these lands still held mysteries older than any king or queen. Daenerys shivered at the sound. Do you think they'll ever return? The pack? Jon stared out into the dim whiteness. I don't know. But they're out there somewhere. They came when we needed them most. Maybe they're still keeping watch. She nodded, eyes drifting toward the broken gate. The hush returned, and in it, Jon sensed the silent guardians of the north, the old gods and their wolves, the memories of everyone who had fought and died for the living. Whatever tomorrow brought, Cersei's armies or the slow grind of reconstruction, he would face it knowing the north was not alone. The land itself had answered once before, and if the need was dire again, perhaps it would answer once more. But in the meantime, they had to be their own salvation. So they remained there, two rulers bound by purpose and sacrifice, listening to the wind in the ruins of Winterfell. Snow covered the scars of battle, and somewhere in the distant forest, a wolf howled a final note of vigil under the dark sky. And though no one knew what would become of the realm, they knew this: the living had stood against the dead and prevailed. The direwolves had turned the tide, reminding them that the north was vast, ancient, and full of raw power. That power might not show itself again, but it lived on in the land, in the hearts of the people, and in the bond between man and wolf. It was there in every breath of frigid air, in every flake of drifting snow, and in the silent prayer of those who survived. In that truth, Jon found hope. He shared it in a gentle look with Daenerys, and together they turned back toward the keep, leaving the echo of the direwolf's howl to fade into the cold, moonlit night.